Now let's talk about what's going on in Niger. There seems to have been another coup in the country, and this is the fourth military coup it is facing since it gained independence from the French in the year 1960.
Power last week have accused France of planning an attack on the presidential palace to free deposed President Mohamed Bazoum. The coup in Niger follows military takeovers in neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso in the past 2 years.
Its former colonial ruler, France, has said it will not recognize the leaders of the putsch and that it still considers deposed President Mohamed Bazoum the sole leader. General Abdurrahmane Chiani, who led the revolts, has named himself president of a new transitional council.
So in the last 3 years, there have been 9 successful military coups in 7 countries, and of all the successful coups, only one coup has been outside of Africa, that is the Asian country of Myanmar. It is safe to say that the military strongmen have retained in Africa with a vengeance, and the question is, are the rest of the democracies in Africa under threat? But in the first place, what is a coup or a coup d'etat? So a coup d'etat or a coup is the sudden, violent overthrow of an existing government by a small group. The main ingredient for a coup is having control of all or part of the armed forces, the police and other security elements. To this point, we saw some rather low-ranking military officers attempt coups in some Western African countries, which did not go well. I guess the rest of the military were thinking, who are these guys? So unlike a revolution, which is usually achieved by large numbers of people working for basic social, economic and political change, think of the winds of change in Africa in the early 90s and mid-90s, which brought democracy for most of Africa. That was revolutionary. Whereas a coup is a change in power from the top that results in the abrupt replacement of leading government personnel. Among the earliest modern coups known to history were those which Napoleon overthrew the French Directorate in November 1799. Although the majority of coups have happened in Africa in recent years, coups were a regular occurrence in various Latin American nations in the 19th and 20th centuries. Examples include Jorge Rafael Videla in Argentina, who overthrew Isabel Perón, the young wife of Juan Perón, who took over from her husband after he had died. That was an interesting coup because it reminded me of Grace Mugabe positioning herself to take over from Robert Mugabe. You remember that Juan Perón's first wife, was it the second wife, was Evita. But anyway, let's get back to it. Fidel Castro is another example, General Pinochet of Chile, and many others. Back home in Africa, we have had many coups, and the sad demise of Patrice Lumumba in 1960 comes to mind as he was overthrown by a very cruel man by the name of Mobutu Sese Seko, who destroyed Zaire, or present-day Democratic Republic of Congo. Then we had people like Ben Bella of Algeria, Obote of Uganda, who was overthrown by none other than the infamous Idi Amin Dada. Some called him the butcher of Africa. The other leaders such as Jerry Rawlings, who came into power through a coup d'etat. Even Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe became the president after the military removed long-time President Robert Mugabe. The 26th of July 2023 saw Niger's democracy overthrown by a military junta. I like the sound of military junta, but what is it? Well, a junta is defined as a government led by a committee of military leaders. So junta is a Spanish word meaning meeting or committee. So normally when the military takes over of a country, they form a committee usually led by the highest ranking officer, say the general, and they make decisions from there. With Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, and now Gabon under military rule, Africa is the undisputed king of military juntas. Most of these coups, thankfully, have been bloodless, and curiously have happened in former French colonies or Franc-Afrique countries except for the Sudan. Niger, a francophone country, is another democracy that has fallen on its democratic sword, some may say. The democratic elected president Mohamed Bazoum, I like the way his name sounds, Bazoum, it's got a ring to it. Now, Bazoum was overthrown on the 26th of January 2023 by the military coup led by General Abdurrahman Chiani, who declared himself as the head of the junta that they called the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland. Ironically, General Chiani was the head of the elite presidential guard responsible for the protection of President Bazoum. Well, I guess he had his own intentions. There are strong reports which indicate that the general did not get along with President Bazoum, and the president was about to remove him from his position, which was going to effectively end General Chiani's 40 years career of military service at 62 years of age, which I think maybe is pretty reasonable, a bit of a due for his retirement. But General Chiani saw it differently. He moved first and removed and detained his boss, President Bazoum. To be fair to President Bazoum, he has only been in power for a couple of years, and he wasn't doing bad either. Bazoum was elected in February 2021, marking the first successful democratic transfer of power in the country's history. This was seen as a major achievement in a country that had seen at least 5 successful coups and numerous other failed attempted military coups since its independence from France in 1960. So we can see there is a lot of military history in this country of Niger. Under President Bazoum, there was some economic growth after the economy of Niger had been stagnant for years. And there was also significant improvement in the security of the country, where hundreds die every year due to terrorist attacks, which had been actually reduced to half by the time President Bazoum got to his second year of presidency. These attacks happened due to violent extremism. Therefore, insecurity has often been used as one of the main reasons by militaries in this region to take over from civilians. So why remove him if he was doing relatively okay compared to all his neighbors? I think he was a victim of circumstances. I'm not trying to back him up, but the broader geopolitical situation in the Sahel of insecurity and the global economic difficulties which are amplified in poor countries played a part. And maybe another important factor which is less talked about is General Chiani's political ambition. But it is what it is. So let's move on. And why is Niger important to the world? Because let's face it, when the war in the Ukraine began, we knew it was important straight away. It was as if the world had come to an end. This was because this was happening in Europe. I do remember major news agencies went crazy and losing their heads, saying statements such as, "They are blue-eyed and blonde and look just like your neighbor," and many other weird and wonderful statements. We should also not forget how Africans who were fleeing the conflict, how badly they were treated, and the people of Indian origin as well. These people of color were treated horribly, exposing biases even in difficult times such as in wars, as well as in situations where choices are between life and death. They were refused entry into Poland or into the last trains out of Kiev and all that. It was so bad. With Africa these days, there has been improvement in coverage, because whatever is happening in Africa, we now know that it affects the world in some way. And thanks to social media as well, the world is not super reliant on large networks such as the BBC, CNN or Fox News. The coverage obviously is nowhere near the levels of European coverage, but Niger and the Sahel region, we know they are just as important as Russia or the Ukraine. So Niger's geographical position is very interesting. It is right in the middle of the Sahel region, and its capital city is Niamey. Now, the Sahel region spans 5,900 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea in the east, in a belt several hundred to 1,000 kilometers wide. It covers an area of over 3 million square kilometers. This belt now is known as the Coup belt, and we can see why they've come up with that term. In recent years, as I said before, Niger had seen an increase in attacks from Boko Haram, ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates who operate in West Africa and the Sahel, attacking government forces, civilians, also kidnapping for ransom. Niger's central location is perfect for powerful nations such as the USA, France and other military powers to monitor and disrupt terror activities which are rife in this region, including performing military activities in surrounding areas such as Libya in this troubled neighborhood. The economy of Niger is agrarian, so it accounts for about 40% of its GDP, and more than half of its population live in extreme poverty, just like in many of these countries. And I wondered about an agrarian economy in an environment like Niger, because the climate, it's the ecological transitional zone, has a hot, steep conditions. The Sahel region borders the more humid Sudanese savannas to its south and the dry Sahara Desert to the north. Now, having an economy which is super reliant on agriculture in the Sahel regions would not be easy. You need advanced technologies to maximize yields. So much expertise required. Agricultural products include millet, sorghum, rice, corn, fruits, vegetables, cotton, peanuts, cassava, cowpeas. So you need machinery and irrigation to maximize yields. So they do have a tough time there with the economy. Resource-wise, uranium, coal, iron ore, tin, phosphates, gold, petroleum. Now, most of these resources are exploited by France through their companies with little benefits to the country. Now, let us look at uranium, which has been talked about in the media a lot. Niger is the 7th largest supplier of uranium in the world and the 5th largest supplier of uranium to the European Union, EU. This is to power its nuclear reactors, which generate electricity across Europe. Uranium is also essential for medical devices such as X-ray machines, MRI, or the CT scans. This is when you go to the hospital and you need a picture of your insides to have a little look what's going on with you. So just in case you need an example of this sort of exploitation, the multi-billion state-backed French nuclear energy company called Orano operates north of Niamey, close to the dusty border with Algeria. I believe they have been operating up to 3 plants, and one of the mines, the uranium is depleted and they've closed it. Not a good look on France. The Orano Group operations dates back to nearly 50 decades ago as a result of the French colonial past with Niger. This is a pattern of previous French colonies where French companies extract the resources. This is why France is always being accused of neo-colonialism and fuels resentments, because simply they don't leave. Talking of the African Union is the peak organization in Africa, similar to the European Union. But the African Union lacks budget and authority, and a hopeless and useless one at that. Africa's most prominent Pan-Africanist, P.L. Lumumba, calls for a revamp of African Union. Indeed, Wadamaya, who is Africa's biggest YouTuber, started a campaign to advocate for PL Lumumba to get to the position of chairman of the African Union. It might have been a tongue-in-cheek. The point they're trying to drive at is that there is need for change in the structure of the African Union to become more effective. Now, which brings me to ECOWAS, the regional bloc. ECOWAS stands for Economic Community of West African States. So, this is a 15-member grouping which include Benin, Burkina Faso, Cape Verde, Cote d'Ivoire, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mali, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Togo. And the new president of Nigeria, President Tinubu, happens to be the chairman of ECOWAS. And he was so keen of giving the Niger military junta deadlines. You know, he talked about 6th of August 2023. That was a week after they'd taken power, and the ECOWAS generals met and they said, we're going to invade Niger and take over through violence, basically. But this deadline came and went and was ignored by the Nigerian army. And the ECOWAS then appeared to be incapable of carrying out the threat. Now, in truth, ECOWAS has some experience in deploying troops to conflict areas in West Africa as peacekeepers, right? But they have never fought a whole nation. This would have been one step too far and unprecedented. The crowning jury of ECOWAS as an intervention force was in January 2017, when Yahya Jammeh, the then president of the Gambia, if you remember, he refused to step down after losing general elections. Now, the ECOWAS sent about 7,000 troops into Gambia. The Gambian army, though, refused to fight ECOWAS, and Yahya Jammeh went into exile. Just to put that into context, though, the Gambian army was a very small army of less than 3,000 or 4,000 men in a country of less than 2.3 million people at the time. They were poorly trained army and ill-equipped. So, if that is the yardstick, this army is different. The Nigerian army is different. As I said, the West, particularly the US and France, have heavily invested in the Niger army in their quest to fight jihadist activity in that region. So the Niger army is formidable. Now, the Africans called this bluff by ECOWAS a knee-jerk reaction, which portrays a general uneasiness of the remaining democracies in this region. They fear that they may be next. Anti-French resentment is at its boiling point in West and Central Africa Francophone countries. Well, let's face it, all colonialism was bad, but the French, they look as if they had the worst form of colonialism, just because they still operate heavily in their former colonies. While in theory, other colonial powers left their colonies to their own devices, the French hanged around and have retained interest through large companies such as Total and Orano to extract resources, as well as through the CFA franc, which is the currency that is used in 8 West African countries and 6 Central African countries. And until 2020, these countries were required to deposit a certain amount of their reserves into the French Central Bank. So critics have voiced as the French way of controlling this currency through monetary means. And you cannot argue with that. The good news is that most of these countries are seeking ways to control their own currencies. However, as long as Niger and Western African countries and Central African countries monetary policies are attached to the French, it's easy to see who is in control. Now, security-wise, the French have a military base in Niger with a reported number of troops up to 2,000. The USA has a large military drone base in Niger worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which they use as the epicenter for their fight against terrorism, due to, as I said, the central location of Niger. And just to emphasize this point, the European Union had set aside over $500 million in aid to Niger in various areas including health, education and industry for 2023 alone, with the USA as well setting aside significant amount for the country. So of all the Sahel region, Niger has been the closest friend of the West, and that is why the USA was hesitant to call out the military takeover, because certain phrases in the USA trigger certain reactions. If they say the military has taken over, that means the USA can't deal with them normally. Remember, the USA were scared to use the word genocide during the Rwandan genocide, because it would have triggered certain actions, like interventions and all that kind of stuff. But at that time, they had just suffered a terrible military operation in Somalia, so no one was keen to get into Rwanda. So therefore, they avoided the word genocide. The Niger military junta has since announced the formation of a government and handpicked an interim prime minister called Lamine Zain al-Mohammed. You have to love those names because they sound so good. They have announced a 3-year transitional period, which means the military junta will be in charge for that period before the government is retained to civilian rule. Now, I won't be holding my breath for it, but please leave your comment below. What do you think about the coup d'etat in general? And also, I'll see you in my next video. And remember, these are a series. We'll cover all the coup d'etats in West Africa, and yep, I am looking forward to seeing you in my next video. So yeah, peace.